and if you could, the first, so I was looking through the 2000 and the 2010, trying to find a kind of paragraph that was the same in both years, across the decade, and you can use it to explain. So this is from the 2000 declaration. It's actually the third paragraph in the declaration, and in very turgid language, committees do not draft well together. But you know, you've got the things that people who work for the UN around and on the issues that they think the UN is an important institution would consider to be the important thing, which is the sense of collective responsibility, human dignity, equality, equity, and the need to target actions meeting the most vulnerable. Let me show you what that thought looks like in 2010, if you could the next. Now, I don't know, and I'd kind of like to hear. It's a shorter, tighter paragraph. Would anyone be able to tell me what disappeared in the 10 years of that?
Children. Collective.
You got it. And that in a nutshell is the big difference of the 10 years. That sense of the collective need to address global problems has really gone from international negotiations. I was listening to the first person on the simulcast, Hans Rosling, who I think, you know, the way he deals with data is fabulous. But thinking about how that translates into then trying to have a global view of things. I mean, in a negotiation sense, not in a. And the point there, when governments are sitting together negotiating, is from a donor perspective, the traditional donor perspective, which is, you know, Western European countries, is target funding where it's needed the most and where it can make the most difference. So what's happened through the last 10 years is the donors want to get a multilateral agreement, an agreement on the UN, that A, governments are primarily responsible for their own development, B, governments that are breaking through the development curve, your India, your Indonesia, your China, your Brazil, countries that are putting their own resources, we heard Thailand, their program, 80% of their own resources went into that. These are not the countries that have to be prioritized. So they're trying to get a multilateral agreement that global funding will go into a narrow sector specific and a narrow country specific sense. And if you could just put up the third one, and this was this paragraph as it worked through the negotiation process. And believe me, I'm sparing you. There are actually 5 paragraphs, but I thought this would be trying. So I'm just kind of quickly, because I think it's, you know, the tensions that are here. So believe it or not, and they spent 6 weeks on fighting on some of this stuff. To move development forward, do you need fundamental freedom for all? And what does that freedom look like? And for example, why can't and Russia are up there? Canada, Australia have indigenous communities with which they are internally trying to manage. They, in an international sense, will sometimes get quite nervous as to how language like this, interpreted in national legislation, could shift the legislation from where they feel it's working. Then the whole issue of, and they spent weeks on this, are they interlinked or interdependent? Development, peace, and security. And behind that discussion on linked or dependent is, if you say dependent, it means to move on any one, you need the other two. And if you say interlinked, it just means to move. You need to figure out that at some level, all 3 of these have to move. And that difference between linked and dependency is major when you're looking at how your national policies are then defined, developed, worked through. They would all agree mutually reinforcing. And then the Russians put in a very long sentence at the bottom, which was intended to address what isn't here, is there were 3 paragraphs that came from the group of developing countries known as the G77, and Russia was trying to use a previously agreed language from another negotiation to just, can we agree on what we've already agreed and move on. And what is in there that was a tension through the document as a whole is how much prominence one gives to human rights. So in the previously agreed language, the respect for all human rights was kind of more in the middle of the paragraph, and for countries that have certain concerns, as they would see it, they wanted to, it's freedom, equality, solidarity, tolerance, and in the way these are sequenced, it's how for many countries as they negotiate is how they see them weighted. So I just wanted to kind of give a sense of why the UN's very turgid prose, as it were, I think is increasingly alienating to many people in the world as they look at what's happening. I mean, Cassie and I were in Copenhagen last year through the whole blow-up of the issues on the Accord, and the discussions that were happening with the NGO community, with many governments, with activists from all over the place who were saying less and less do they see how working with the UN, they kind of get to the crispness of the MDGs. And what I think that discussion misses out is development has become more complex. And to answer the question I think you'd asked, Emily, when we were watching the simulcast, of what to me was missing is that sense that development is complex and it is interlinked. And 1 through 7, my problem at the time when I saw the MDGs, I've become much more a believer in terms of how it, at the national level, makes a difference, but at the global level of how one looks at the whole package, the policies at the global level that only a few countries in the world control, in the IMF, in the World Bank, in the Security Council, policies like tax regimes, which no developing country thus far is at the table of the OECD DAC when they're negotiating how they will at the international level deal with taxation and double taxation and corporate taxation. Policies like setting the price of a lot of the drugs. Policies on debt, on trade, on access, are not, to me, at the level at which I work, cannot be divorced in a conversation from what a national government can achieve in part on education, on health, on equity issues. It's not, we can't say the world is much more global, we can learn from each other, and there's a broader knowledge base, and how do we come together to support each other, and then define a set of actions that assumes that the major actor, the sole actor almost, is that national government working this way, and that we don't need a platform that does look at policy coherence also across what are considered to be the traditional donors, and that the new donors coming in, as some of those developing countries come through. Chile is now a member of the OECD DAC. Brazil and Venezuela are major actors in Latin America. China is a massive partner into Africa. I would expect that we should be able to come to a framework at the global level that says when you work in countries, your work cannot move your national agenda through in a way that doesn't look at what that country is trying to achieve, and which it may in fact undercut it. So, as I said, this very turgid document, and I think the 2010 summit outcome would not, if you read through it, it would be very difficult for someone to come through this and get something that's like, boom, something to move on, something that we can be creative on, something that actually is comprehensible. End hunger, end poverty. I don't think that one could get from the 2010 to that so crisply. In part because it's a more complex world, in part because nobody at the table, in particular the traditional donors, wanted to make new commitments, wanted to discuss funding. So this UN negotiations have in essence become a proxy for other more fundamental fights that are going on. The fight on human rights and moving a human rights agenda forward, to which donors can determine funding flows. The major fight in this document, and if you hadn't sat through the negotiations, you wouldn't even be able to see it if you read it, is for the European Union. What they wanted to get in this document was an agreement that from here on in, all their funding is going to be prioritized, all their multilateral funding is going to be prioritized to countries in crisis. So, because the EU has taken a decision that their two major priorities for funding are crisis and crisis, conflict, and climate, which is absolutely within their right to do, but they wanted to sign off. So you wouldn't even be, that they didn't succeed on, that whole piece of it is buried in the 5th sentence of a short paragraph, but it drove through this document, the whole discussion on conflict and how one deals with funding for conflict and how multilateral, how ODA flows go and where the UN works. And do we work on a broad development agenda against all in all countries, or is there a view that 80% of the countries are owning the kind of MDG agenda, and funding and the UN should only work in a very few countries, was one of the biggest pieces of the fight on this document. And you would not, if you hadn't sat through all the 3 in the morning fights, you wouldn't even know it. I think it's why we've become increasingly kind of opaque and difficult to understand from the outside. But I think it's also important to understand why there is, as Galil has said, about other colleagues have said, this increasing disconnect. We're living in a world, I think, media is the good and the bad of media, is it can be very transformative, but they want crisp stories. Nobody wants complexity, and therefore, the argument is over. Don't sell complexity because nobody wants to seek the complexity. It takes too long to explain. And you can't, I think, do global politics without doing complexity. And now we're at 193 countries. So it's a lot of complexity and it's a lot of agendas. So to me, moving forward, it's yes, the MDGs, but I wish, and I keep arguing within my own institution, that some thought on the goal 8, how do you link the big global policy pieces on debt, on aid, on trade, on where military funding in developed goes in developing countries, on some pieces that are never put on the table, on how the humanitarian agenda moves through. I wish that there would be some thought to not thinking of the MDGs in the whole descriptor of as the 1 through 7 on the national level, because the 8 is too complex or too complicated in other ways to link. So I will kind of leave you with that thought. I think then the other pieces of the great success stories, which are, irrespective of that fight, there is movement forward on the ground in a lot of countries, are fabulous. But I would hope that in the discussions, I'd love to hear if there are ideas on how one comes back to the complexity of narrowing that disconnect